I'm Robert Horn, and I'm following the path of Edward Lear, artist, poet, humorist, and traveller. Lear was one of the few people to explore the turbulent southern Balkans during the 19th century. I'm taking his remarkable journal and drawings with me to find out what became of Lear's world. Thank you. Up this way. It was November 1848, and Lear had crossed the Balkans coast to coast from Thessaloniki to the Albanian Adriatic in search of landscapes to paint.
But if you go out into the real landscape, some of it has hardly changed at all, and the qualities he's describing are still true. Greek historians and art historians will tell you that he captured the Greece of the mid-19th century in a way beyond that any other painter did. There's something both eternal and of their time in his work. He said that I am one with the trees, the clouds, the rocks. He felt a huge sympathy for landscape.
When Lear came here in 1848, there was no international border. He was travelling in the Ottoman Empire. As the Albanian mountains recede, a modern highway whisks me into Greece. Lear was travelling south with a sack full of drawings on his way home. But events were to alter his plans and send him on a new adventure which would take him all the way back to the Aegean again. These remote mountains of the southern Balkans were once home to nomads and shepherds. Lear found them roaming free across huge distances, unimpeded by borders. I wonder what has happened to their traditional way of life. I was lucky to find one of a dwindling number of traditional farms run by a Vlach family. The Vlachs were the main nomadic people of this region, who had their own distinctive culture and language. Antigone's family had farmed here for generations.
Some people go as far as the border. They go away in the autumn and they return in the spring. They go to the place where they pass the winter, and then they come here again, here up in the mountains.
You took over the farm from your father. Can you see your children taking over the farm from you?
It is difficult, very, very difficult. No young person stays here anymore. They will all look elsewhere, because it is a hard job, a very hard job. The loneliness, the hardship, and the like. Here there is great tiredness. Great tiredness. 24 hours a day you have to work. Every season has its tasks. In the summer it is only grazing. We get the sheep to graze and we take the milk. In the autumn they give birth. We will raise the lambs, we will sell them. We will then also take the milk. The sheep also give us their wool. And the work goes on.
Today, the Vlachs' traditional pastures are not only split by international borders, but increasing road traffic has created new problems.
Every day. This is a great problem because the national motorway is here, and there is always a problem, which means that the entire staff have to gather to help the sheep cross from one side to the other.
Lear was now travelling in the footsteps of Lord Byron, who had passed this way some 40 years earlier. He made a detour to to stay at the monastery of Zitsa, which Byron had immortalized in his epic poem, Childe Harold. Although Byron fell in love with the place, Lear unfortunately arrived in a storm, soaked to the skin. Professor Theodore Cosmas, an authority on Edward Lear, helps look after the monastery.
Όσον αφορά το Lear, ακολούθησε εδώ το Lord of Verona. Βροχή στο δρόμο, κακό. Και βέβαια είναι σχεδόν σίγουρο ότι σε αυτή την βορειοδυτική πλευρά έμεινε τόσο ο Byron όσο και ο Lear.
Oh, it's nice and spacious.
Yes, it's a very spacious room for a traveller, especially if one thinks of the trials that travellers had to endure on the journey. There's on the road, on horseback, and so on. He confessed that the only thing he wanted after such a storm was to find a warm shelter, to rest, and to have a good meal. Also, the artist had health problems. As you know, he suffered from spells of epilepsy and had a strong tendency to melancholic depression. So if we combine the bad weather with his health problems, it's easier to understand why his mood was ruined.
And I don't see Lear. Do you think maybe one day you could have a picture of Edward Lear in here also?
As he was one of the many who honoured our monastery, I feel his picture has a place here.
The monks of Zitsa not only knew how to look after their guests, but they produced one of the most famous wines in Greece.
And these photographs?
These photographs show the way the grapes were collected and other activity in the vineyard. For example, here are the grapes being harvested. Here also is the harvesting and weighing of the grapes. These grapes are destined for the market. Here is my father, carrying a container of grapes on his shoulders. And here are my mother and father. The containers are empty, but they will soon be filled with grapes.
Γεια μας. It's very good. Πολύ καλά.
Πολύ καλό.
Were it possible, I would gladly pass the summer here. It is not easy to appreciate the beauty of the scenery in a hasty visit. The outlines of the mountains around are too magnificent to be readily reducible to the rules of art. And the want of foliage on the plain and hills may perhaps at first give a barren air to the landscape.
Lear really liked Yanina to the extent that he came back here 3 times. What he appreciated was whereas up north, when he was drawing, people would throw stones at him, call him shaitan. Here, in the streets, he was entirely unmolested. Except for one point, 3 Turkish officers came up towards him and started remonstrating with him that he wasn't using London white paper.
In fact, Lear was using his best coloured paper, as he did to make this drawing of the citadel.
The beauty of Yanina made a deep impression on Lear. But this beauty belies a bloody history. It is a city forever associated with Ali Pasha, a tyrant infamous for remorseless savagery towards his subjects. This despotic ruler had carved out his own fiefdom in Albania and northern Greece. Ali Pasha was already dead when Lear visited, but his mystique still hung over the region and does so today. Inspired by Yanina, Lear was determined to come back to do it justice. But for now, he pressed on to Arta, famous for its beautiful bridge, which legend has it kept falling down until the builder incarcerated his wife in one of the pillars. From here, Lear could make his way to the coast in order to go home for the winter, recover his strength, and replenish his materials.
I'm standing on this dramatic causeway between the Gulf of Vamvratkikos and the lagoons. Arta is over there, and Lear was in Arta and had to get to Preveza, which is over there. He had to wait until midnight because of this very wind going in exactly in the wrong direction. And so he didn't see this dramatic sight. The sweetwater lagoons here are very special, and hopefully we will see pelicans.
Well, as you know, Edward Lear began his career as a zoological draftsman. He painted those magnificent plants and birds, but it seems that the minute details he was drawing were a strain on his eyesight, so he decided from a very early age to abandon his very successful career as a zoological draftsman and take up to landscape painting. So, in fact, accuracy was part of his drawing method.
Some people think he was the finest ornithological illustrator that England has ever produced. But in landscape, he had both the pleasure of drawing and the element of exploration, adventure, travel, and so on. He could combine these two.
The Ambrakikos Gulf is an important nature reserve, particularly for birds. Dimitri Bakodimos, one of the rangers, has agreed to take me out on his boat. Lear described an abundance of wildlife, which is today everywhere under threat. But I'm told this area is a perfect environment for pelicans. Lear had drawn them in Albania, but I missed out on them there.
Fine. See, that is amazing. I was really privileged to see that. That's a group of baby or juvenile pelicans being babysat by one adult, while the rest of the mums and dads are off fishing, and they come back at about 11 or 12 o'clock and feed the babies. Isn't that extraordinary?
Μπορούμε να δούμε γύρω στα
We can see about 180 pelican couples. That is about 400 to 450 birds. Until 1980, there were only 20 couples. Then the Ornithological Society started a campaign of protection of the birds by marking them. The locals have been included in this program of protection, and we can say that now everybody is protecting the pelicans. And so, from 20 couples in 1980, we have now reached the 180 couples. A very important factor, and one could say one of the most important threats, is man. If man cannot comprehend what he has, there is no way this wetland is going to continue to exist. Because the important thing is not the Ambrakikos Gulf you and I see, but the Ambrakikos Gulf we are going to deliver to future generations. That is why we try to protect this.
Let's look at that. You're catching eels. How big eels? This is a small one. How big do they come?
They can come about 1.5 meters.
Oh, really? This big? So how many do you catch in a day?
It's depending from the day.
Oh, yeah. He'll stay overnight here?
Yes, yes,
yeah.
Especially in the winter.
And
the black stilts. It's very beautiful.
Yeah.
The next spring, Lear was back in Preveza. He made a short walk up to nearby Nicopolis, the most extensive Roman remains in Greece. Nicopolis was built by Caesar Augustus to commemorate his victory over Antony and Cleopatra in the famous Battle of Actium, which took place here in the Gulf.
This is like an amphitheatre.
I met Nikos Karabelis, a local businessman who helps look after the ruins, and who, it turns out, is something of a Lear expert.
We're on the orchestra of it.
Like an Odeon. This is what I like, to find exactly the spot where Lear drew his drawings. Whereabouts?
I think if you sit
It must
down
be somewhere here.
Look. Yes. Look.
It's somewhere here.
The gate there, the western gate of the walls, is just behind those trees. If you sit down...
He must have sat here.
Yes, I think so.
In the shade. That's why he chose here. It must have been the afternoon.
And you can see the Ambracian Gulf on his drawings.
This is fantastic. I love it when it happens like this.
His drawings are important because we see how life was at that time.
Great as was the destruction of Nicopolis by Ali Pasha, who carried off vast portions of it for the construction of his palace at Preveza, there is yet an abundance of picturesque beauty in what remains. And the view from the upper seats of the great theatre looking across the Gulf of Ambracia to the hills is one of the most noble of prospects.
Those locals that are sitting in the cave of the Odeon must have sit down there somewhere.
He would have been here, perhaps with his easel in front, sketching away. I think he used to draw very quickly.
He drew so much every day.
Yeah, he'd do 6, 7, 8, 9, sometimes more sketches, including going 20 miles journey on horseback. Well, it's taking us about 2 hours to do what Lear took 2 days with, but I can't understand how he did it in 2 days. The guy was indefatigable. It's extraordinary. Going on muleback down, presumably not brilliant paths. And he used to lose his luggage every now and again and have to put it back on the horses. They don't seem to bother about the dogs at all.
Lear's plan was still to reach Mount Athos in the east, exploring on the way. He took a route through the wild region of the Suliots, whose bloody struggles against the Turks had already entered romantic legend. Ominously, there were vultures on the road. I only met goats.
He wanted to see the location of one of the most extraordinary events that had occurred only 40 years earlier. It has become symbolic of the virulent acts of terror that Ali Pasha inflicted on the local people.
I met Spiros Raptis, whose family links with the Suliots go back generations.
Edward Lear came on a track like this, near this gorge, and he stayed overnight in Ali Pasha's castle. Can you tell me about the castle there?
The castle was built by the Venetians. In 1803, when Ali Pasha occupied Suli, it was used to house the Turkish garrison which controlled the Suli villages. The wars of Suli with Ali Pasha were from 1790 to 1803. It was now a matter of honor for Ali Pasha to conquer Suli. Therefore, when he managed to take control of the area, he was very, very harsh towards the Suliots.
He knew about the story, and he met people who remembered the thing actually happening, and that they were very sad about it, obviously.
This is very emotional. May I say my family comes from Suli, on my grandmother's side. They were one of the largest families of Suli, and had to leave in December 1803.
Και αναγκάστηκαν όλοι τους και έφυγαν το 1803 τον Δεκέμβρη. Αυτές τις ιστορίες τις έχουμε ακούσει από τους
These stories we heard from our parents, from grandfather to grandfather, from mouth to mouth. The witnesses have told us what happened in Suliot.
At that time, northern Greece and Albania were part of the Ottoman Empire, and there had been a great deal of suppression and suffering of the local people. The Suliots in particular had suffered hugely. He was worried by this element of constraint and suppression of the natural indigenous people that he saw within the empire.
And while toiling up the hill, my thoughts were occupied less with the actual interest of the scenery than with the extraordinary recollections connected with the struggles of the heroic people who so lately as 40 years back were exterminated or banished by the tyrant enemy. Every turn in the pass I am about to enter has been distinguished by some stratagem or slaughter. Every line in the annals of the last Suliot War is written in characters of blood.
But what was the terrible event that inspired Lear to make this pilgrimage deep into the mountains?
Zalongo, a spectacular memorial to the martyrdom of the Suli women. Local historian Konstantinos Tsimas explains what happened here in 1803.
There is a monastery below which is ancient, the oldest in Epirus, built about 680 AD. Some Suliot women were sheltering in the monastery as the Turks started their slow ascent up the mountain. There these women were captured and then taken off to Yanina as slaves by Ali Pasha. Some others, the majority widows with small children, came up here to the point where we are now, just 100 meters to the east. When they saw the Turks approaching, they were afraid of losing their honor and having their children taken as slaves to Ali Pasha. So they threw the children off the cliff and holding hands started dancing in a circle. They were dancing the dance of Zalongo and greeting the world with the words of its song. Goodbye, wretched world. Goodbye, sweet life. And then one by one, they also threw themselves into the abyss. When the Suliot men saw such a heroic act from these women, they decided to fight their way out.
Ώρα μηδέν, η λευτεριά της πρόλαβε όλες και πριν ο ήλιος δύσει, κραυγή αντίχησε από της αβύσσου το χάος. Κάλιο ο θάνατος παρά η ατίμωση. Στο ακούσμά της τα βουνά πήραν φωτιά, το Αιγαίο αγρίεψε. Στα φτερά της η άβρα την έκανε τραγούδι, εγερτήριο σάλπισμα και όλη η Ελλάδα στάρματα τον τύρανο χτυπάει.
This remarkable reenactment happens every year, and this year I was told there were about 3,500 people here. The event itself happened 50 years before Lear was here, and as I understand it, immediately preceded the Suli women throwing themselves off the rock. And what happens now is a festival of dancing.
Even today, over 200 years after the event, the great and the good gather every year to pay their respects to the courage of the Suliots.
When he left Suli village, Lear wanted to get to Parga, and he came down the route behind me, but they got stuck in the marshes. He had a guide called Andrea who was distraught about getting lost. He said he'd never got lost before, and he was an old man, and it must be his memory that was losing. Lear took a long time consoling him. Anyway, they ended up in the village over there, Musia, where they stayed the night. And Lear, at midnight, walked down the strand, and the moon rose, and he said it was absolutely charming.
Late at night, I strolled onto the bright sands and enjoyed the strange scene. Air seems peopled with fireflies, earth with frogs which roar and croak from the wide Akruzim marsh. Low-walled huts cluster around. Albanians are stretched on mats along the shore. Huge watchdogs lie in a circle around the village. The calm sea ripples, and the faint outline of the hills of desolate Suli is traced against the clear and spangled sky.
When Lear finally arrived in Parga, it was a desolate place. Parga had been betrayed by the British, who sold it to Ali Pasha. The Greek population duly packed their bags and fled to Corfu, allowing Ali to enter and destroy the empty town.
For centuries, the area around Parga was renowned for the quality of its olives. However, when Edward Lear was here, the town and the olive groves were so devastated that he wished he hadn't come. Thankfully, everything's back to its former glory. Kalimera.
Yeah.
Very nice to meet you. Could we see the olive press?
Yes.
Sakos Hakis runs this traditional olive press.
Αυτό είναι ένα ελαιοτριβείο. Έγινε το 1965. Αυτό είναι το λάδι.
This is the end product.
Yes.
It's amazing. It's in a...
Δεν φαίνεται από εκεί.
This is not for the tractor. So beautiful. Doesn't look like pastoral at all.
Εδώ κάθονται μία ώρα. Μία ώρα.
Uh-huh. Καλημέρα.
Καλημέρα. Καλώς ορίσατε.
Καλημέρα.
Αυτές εδώ είναι οι ελιές.
Oh, these are the olives from here?
Yes, ναι.
Wonderful.
Και αυτά εδώ θα ρίξουμε λάδι εδώ να δοκιμάσουμε το ψωμί. Αυτές οι ελιές είναι δικές μας από εδώ, τις σαλατίζουμε.
I love olive oil, and this should be the best I've ever tasted. I'm sure it is. Let's see.
Δεν πειράζει.
It's very, very delicious. Very good.
Κάνει καλά στην καρδιά.
Good for the heart.
Ναι, στην καρδιά.
Κυκλοφορεί το αίμα.
It's good for the soul.
The journey inspired Lear to plan a major work on the region, a project, sadly, he never completed. He headed back to Yanina, a place, despite the rain, he loved.
Three days passed at Yanina. The mornings are brilliant, but clouds gather on Mitsikeli about 9 or 10. And from noon to 3 or 4, thunder and pouring rain ensues. The air is extremely cold, and whereas at Parga I could only bear the lightest clothing, I am here too glad to wear double capote, and half the night I'm too cold to sleep.
One of the places to visit in Yanina is the island on the lake with its picturesque little fishing village. But its walls conceal a dark story.
There are 5 churches on this tiny island, but also here in a wooden house is where Ali Pasha met his dramatic end. Local journalist Georgios Tsiafas explains what happened.
Here we are at the place where Ali Pasha was shot. We see what is considered to be a very important painting of him. It is the presentation of the head of Ali Pasha to the Sultan. Here we are exactly at the spot where Ali Pasha lay wounded. His people dragged him in here from outside. He was just lightly wounded, and they dragged him indoors, and they laid him here. Meanwhile, the guards were outside exchanging fire, so the people from Hursit Pasha came from underneath, and they shot him from down below. Whilst he lay here, they shot him in the abdomen, and he died. Once the resistance from outside was spent, they came in. They dragged him out there, exactly on the stairs, and they cut his head off. In short, he was wounded in the abdomen, and whilst his soul faltered, they dragged him out and cut his head off.
Ici, là, voilà. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
So somewhere around here, on the steps. Hey, this is pink. Could this be Ali Pasha's blood, do you think? They laid him out there and then chopped his head off and took it off to the Sultan. Poor old Ali Pasha. But there is more to Yanina than Ali Pasha. It is one of modern Greece's most vibrant cities and a major cultural centre. Passing the music school, I was intrigued by singing that put me in mind of Lear's stay in an abysmal khan where he was serenaded by what he called wild octave singing.
Lear had a keen ear for music and always noted the local traditions. Epirus, both in Greece and Albania, is celebrated for this kind of polyphonic singing.
The song speaks of a man from Metsovo who was a man of letters in his youth, but who, in old age, becomes an outlaw fighting the Turks. From Yanina, Lear took the road east, the road that would take you all the way to Constantinople, if you so wished. But to get from west to east, you have to cross a great mountain barrier whose peaks reach 2,500 meters.
The Pindos Mountains. In Lear's day, very few travellers came here at all. It was simply too difficult, apart from intrepid people like Lear himself. The village of Metsovo up here was virtually inaccessible. In the next few years, things are going to change again. There's a stunning bridge being built just here. It is awe-inspiring. The construction across this huge valley is incredible. In 150 years, we're traveling 50 times the speed, well, legally anyway, we could go even faster, 50 times the speed that Lear went through, but he saw 50 times as much. We traveled straight through the landscape. He considered every blade of grass almost, so that in many respects, he had a great advantage over us.
Metsovo is inhabited by Vlachi or Vlachians. a people of Wallachian descent. In general, their employment is that of shepherds, and as such they move about with their flocks from district to district. But in certain parts of the mountains, settled colonies of them exist, who possess large flocks of sheep and goats and are distinguished for their industrious and quiet habits of life. They retain their language.
High up, almost lost in these mountains, are remote stone-built settlements with their own unique character. The most important town is Metsovo, the center of Vlach culture. I wonder how much of the Vlach identity and language is preserved today.
Konstantinos is one of the last members of the Vlach community to dress in traditional costume. He's been selling produce from the local villages since 1965, but in a few months, he's going to retire.
Are these your grandchildren? Ah. I noticed the old guys in the village, some of them aren't speaking Greek. And this is up in the mountain in the summer.
Το χειμώνα πάμε Θεσσαλία, βγαίνουμε Οκτώβριο και ερχόμαστε στο Μάιο. Το Μέτσοβο εδώ και 15 χρόνια είχε 60.000 πρόβατα. Τώρα έχουν μειωθεί περίπου τα 15.
These are fabulous cheeses, but this is the special Metsovo cheese. Oh, that's delicious. That's smoked. Smoked cow cheese. That's very nice. 22.5.
Many old crafts and skills are still practiced here, like the traditional dressmaker I found in the town square, George Bubas.
Παρακαλώ, ορίστε. Περάστε.
Γεια σας.
Γεια σου. Τι κάνεις? Καλά.
Rob.
Δυνατός.
Nice to meet you.
Έτσι, κάθισε.
Yeah, thank you.
Δουλειά. Και εμείς
We embroider and we sew costumes, woolen things, all the clothes they used to wear here in the olden days. The shepherds who wore their capes, the women with their embroidered clothes. We did not only do embroidery, we made the capes, the burazanes, the shirts of the animal farmers to take the sheep in the winter or in the summer. I have downstairs at the shop window a piece from Yanina, purpury, that the noble ladies of Yanina used to wear. That was a year's work.
How do you see the future of these traditional clothes?
Δεν βλέπω μέλλον.
I see no future in it. For many reasons. They are costly to make. There are people who would like to have a piece made, but there is no future because the demand is not enough for a young person to want to be involved, or for a group of people to take up this work, and no sufficient care has been taken for it to be preserved. So I see no future. The skill will be lost.
It seems that the traditional way of life is hanging on by a thread. Eventually, it will only be sustained by the demands of tourism, and soon any real contact with Lear's world will be lost.
Normally, I like to find the exact spot that Lear was when he made his drawing. By contrast, this time, I put myself into his picture.
My descent from the Pindos mountains takes me into the unique landscape of Meteora, with its famous monasteries that look down from what appear to be inaccessible heights.
Strange, unearthly-looking rocks are these, full of gigantic chasms and round holes, resembling Gruyere cheese as well, highly magnified, the surface otherwise being perfectly smooth.
This is the delightful monastery of Varvara Rusanu, which for the last 20 years has been inhabited by nuns. Up until then, Meteora was exclusively a male domain. The story is that early in the 20th century, Varlam, the large monastery to my left, caught fire, and people from the village, both men and women, came up with pails of water in order to help put it out. And that sort of opened the door, and women have subsequently been admitted into Meteora. And this is a lovely, lovely spot.
To get into the monasteries, visitors had to come up by basket or rope ladder.
This looks like a very old net. I hope they're not using that net these days.
Not only here, but for all the monasteries, this was the only way to gain access until about 1920. That's when the stairs were made in all the monasteries. Until then, as we said, there was the net for heavy things, and they had some rope ladders for people to use, but it was dangerous. They couldn't come up so easily. And that explains why the ascent of Lear would not have been easy, as he had to come up in that way. If you look down, you see what a great height it is. Simple for a time gone by, but to us it seems impossible.
Did you ever go in this basket?
In 1970 or 71, I don't remember exactly, when I was a student, I came up 2 or 3 times with the net. Of course, I was young and the height didn't bother me, and I could come up like that. But now I wouldn't consider anything like it.
Well, I don't think I'd like to go in. It looks a little rotten now. I don't think it's been used for many years. I should point out that this is only the last quarter of the rise. You have to walk up 3/4 until you get to this point.
When one would come up or down, they would surely pray. If you're going to go into such an abyss, you ought to pray. You will see the icons that people prayed to coming up or down. The life of the monks and the people here is a continuous prayer. To pray continuously, as our Holy Fathers have said, prayer strengthens man greatly.
Demetrius Demos, a local farmer who I met here, turns out to be yet another Greek with a passion and knowledge of Edward Lear.
I have read his descriptions of Thessaly, and I know from these descriptions that he came from that opening when he arrived here. He refers to Kastraki, Kalambaka, which is behind the mountains, and from what I can see from the sketches and paintings that he made them from the back here. The rocks are millions of years old, and the monastery 600. They have not changed at all, and they remain. As they were 150 years ago, so they are today.
There are a lot of holes in the rocks and old monasteries, maybe, that are derelict.
This is an old monastery that used to be there. But the other gaps you see in the rocks were those made by solitary monks who came here starting in the 11th century, before the monasteries were built, until St. Athanasius, when he came here in the 13th or 14th century, organized monastic life and established the model for monastic life.
Οργάνωσε τη μοναστική ζωή, έβαλε ας πούμε το τυπικό, αν το πούμε έτσι, της μοναστικής ζωής.
The town is much bigger than it was when Lear was here, and I presume that's to do with more people coming to Meteor. Tourists come now, a lot of tourists.
Πολύ πιο εύκολα από ότι την εποχή του Lear.
It's much easier than in the time of Lear. Then, very few and very cool-blooded people would be able to come to visit the East, as we say.
Despite being on the dry side of the mountain, Lear was still troubled by the weather, and his advice to artists was not to travel in this region during the rainy season.
From Meteora, Lear's final destination was still Mount Athos. The weather had got so bad, however, he almost decided to turn back. Luckily for him and for me, the weather improved sufficiently for him to go further east. And that's where I'm going.
From Meteora, the road descends into the plain of Thessaly, famous since ancient times for its horses. This is where Demetrios Demos has his farm, which he has dedicated to the preservation of rare breeds.
There are 400 horses that have been recognized as the Thessalian breed by the University of Thessalonica and by the Greek state, as a rare Greek breed under threat.
So out of 400, there are about 50 here. You have an eighth of the total number of Thessaly horses.
Yes, in all of Thessaly there are 400. And I have 39, and 11 are ponies of Skyros. Animal historians confirm that these horses are 10,000 years old. They have been since 8000 BC as they are now. And they have developed through the centuries according to the needs of people and how they used them. From these horses came the Thessalian cavalry. From these horses, Phidias depicted the gables and the friezes on the Parthenon.
It is said that the plain was once a lake, and it is almost completely encircled by mountains. In the distance, Mount Olympus. Lear saw sad trails of migrating families with all their belongings, a common sight at that time. Where once buffalo ploughed, combine harvesters now reap the rewards of Greece's breadbasket.
From the plain, to reach the sea and a boat to Mount Athos, Lear had to pass through the Vale of Tempe, the gorge that separates Mount Olympus from Mount Ossa. At the entrance to the gorge, there is a mosque.
The little square room in the teke, or house of the dervish, was perfectly clean and neat. And while I ate my supper on the sofa surrounding it, the well-behaved Dedi Effendi sat smoking in an opposite corner. His son, the smallest possible dervish, 5 or 6 years old, dressed like his father in all points excepting his beard, squatted by his side. For the dervish is a married man, and his wife, he assures me, has made 1 or 2 dishes for my particular taste, and is regarding me at this moment through a lattice at the top of the wall.
158 years ago, almost to the day, Lear wrote about staying in this tekke, the house of the dervish who looked after this lovely mosque, now sadly neglected.
This convent at Barba was the place for travellers to stay. The resident dervish was obliged to lodge and feed any passer-by. His good nature gave Lear a much more favourable impression of dervishes who had given him such a hard time in Albania.
It may have been a particularly bad year, but poor Lear had dreadful weather this side of Greece. Meteora, Larissa, even down to the coast, it rained and rained. He has 4 or 5 short chapters in his diary. 5 days in a row, he starts, "Oh, the woes of Thessaly, it's raining again." Not easy to sketch in the rain, but he managed. I can understand Lear's depression, and he did get quite low this end of the journey.
Alas, the woes of Thessaly. It is again pouring with rain, and the wind is set in southerly, so that once and for all together I give up all idea of sailing to Athos.
Finally, Lear had reached the Aegean coast at Tempe, from where in the distance he saw Mount Athos, his holy grail. By now, Lear was suffering from fever, but he had not given up his quest.
Here at Volos, he tried to get a boat, but the winds were against him. The weather was bad. He had failed. So, what did this extraordinary man do next? He turned west again and crossed the Balkans for a 3rd time.
As I ride away, Volo and the scattered villages on the hills seem truly beautiful. But to what purpose should I linger? Tomorrow and tomorrow may be equally wet. Mount Athos, Mount Athos. All my toil has been in vain, and I shall now most possibly never see you more.
Lear wondered why the storks of Thessaly seemed to have abandoned the local Greeks. Apparently, they only nested on Muslim rooftops. He needn't have worried. The storks didn't abandon Greece. They're definitely still here, and these are nesting on a church.
When Lear came to this sleepy little village of Nomi, he got involved in a local wedding and was invited to the reception after. Nothing going on here today, but there may be something in nearby Trikala.
I've been lucky and have been invited to a lavish affair, certainly grander than Lear's village wedding, but the service is the same.
I think the reason that Lear didn't marry was because of his epilepsy. He had suffered from epilepsy from very early childhood, and he saw it as an inherited disease. His sister was also an epileptic. And he knew that the chances were that if he married, he might pass this on to his children. It was something that dominated his life. And the loneliness came from the isolation forced upon him by the epilepsy. Although he was very sociable, he was also, basically, au fond, he was a very lonely man because he had this secret that he couldn't share with anybody. That cut him off from the people around him, I think, to a huge extent.
Lear enjoyed the wedding party, taking his usual delight in the local dancing and costumes. This is modern Greece, where tradition lives on inside modern structures like this vast custom-built reception hall. Walking through the lively streets of towns such as Larissa and Trikala, Lear's world seems far away. 150 years ago, these towns were oppressed backwaters of the decaying Ottoman Empire. Now, they're prosperous and Greek, with a relaxed Mediterranean air. Sadly, Lear made little comment in his diary as he passed through on his journey back. By now, he was exhausted.
Lear returned to Corfu, which he made his home on and off for the next 15 years. From here, he made many paintings of the island that he loved and the far-off mountains of Albania, which continued to cast their spell on him. And finally, he made it to Mount Athos. The journey of 1848 was not the end, it was only the beginning.
He was a great get-up-and-go sort of man. He grabbed difficulties. He confronted the problems of travel, the winding paths along steep cliffs, the collapsing bridges where he could see the fierce torrents below. He steeled himself. He didn't always enjoy them, but if he wanted to see something beyond, to see this beautiful scenery, he knew that he had to take risks, and he was prepared to do that.
Don't think on this man simply as a writer of silly limericks and nice nonsense poems. Regard him as a cipher of Victorian humanity, an important influence on the way we currently see, feel, and think. I salute you, Edward Lear.